Somewhere in Wyoming, about 12,800 years ago, someone was bored. The woolly mammoths were still roaming, writing hadn't been invented yet, and there wasn't a single city on Earth. And yet, that person picked up a small piece of bone, shaped it, marked one side, and threw it. They were rolling dice. And that changes pretty much everything we thought we knew about ancient humans. Here's what this video is actually about. We tend to imagine prehistoric people as purely survival machines. Hunt, eat, sleep, repeat. That's the version we got in school. But the archaeological record tells a completely different story. Ancient humans were gaming, joking, playing board games, and gambling long before anyone built a pyramid or wrote a word. And some of what they were doing is genuinely stranger and more sophisticated than anything you'd expect. By the end of this, you're going to look at the board games on your shelf differently. And there's one entry near the end of this list that I think is the most revealing thing we've ever found about who ancient humans actually were. Keep that in mind as we go. Let's start with something that happened in a grave. At Boredom in Turkey, archaeologists uncovered 49 small gaming tokens inside a burial site. These things were shaped like pigs, dogs, pyramids, and other abstract forms. They were found alongside colored shell and stone pieces and date back roughly 5,000 years, making them potentially the oldest known gaming set on Earth. And here's the part that should bother you a little. Nobody knows how the game was played. We have the pieces. We have the board. We just can't reconstruct the rules. Scholars have looked at this set for years and still can't fully agree on what was happening. So we have a 5,000-year-old game that someone loved enough to be buried with, and we're completely locked out of it. The game outlived its own instruction manual by about 49 centuries. That's the thing about ancient games. They keep showing up in places that make you realize how deeply people needed them. Archaeological evidence shows that games, hunting simulations, and communal rituals were already established features of prehistoric life, long before organized civilization. But we kept assuming games came after culture, after cities, after writing. The dice from Wyoming prove that assumption is completely wrong. The oldest specimens identified in a study published in American Antiquity date to roughly 12,800 to 12,200 years ago. And unlike modern six-sided dice, these objects were two-sided. The earliest examples come from late Pleistocene Folsom period sites in Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. And these artifacts are more than 6,000 years older than comparable dice found in the Old World. Let that land for a second. Before this discovery, the oldest dice on record were from Mesopotamia, made around 5,500 years ago. Now we're talking about the end of the last ice age. These weren't pebbles someone accidentally kicked around. The pieces were flat, two-sided dice crafted from wood or bone and could be tossed, similar to how we flip a coin today. They were deliberately designed objects, found at 57 separate archaeological sites. Someone was making these on purpose, across a huge geographic range over thousands of years. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting. These dice games weren't just entertainment. These games were historically tools for social cohesion, increasingly important as isolated groups of people began to grow and mingle more. Researchers argue that games of chance created what they call neutral, rule-governed spaces, situations where two groups of strangers could sit down, agree on the rules, and interact safely. You couldn't attack someone you were mid-game with. The game was a kind of social contract. Games of chance may have allowed the Folsom people to trade for their preferred stones, and unlike modern gambling, indigenous gambling was more of a one-to-one personal interaction, where the odds tended toward 50-50 over time, and the stakes were trade items like a set of hides or semi-precious stones. So what looked like boredom killing was actually functioning as diplomacy. The dice table was a peace table. Now hold that thought, because the games get more complex from here, and one of them is going to completely reframe how you think about ancient spirituality. Senet is one of the earliest known board games, dating to around 3100 BC. The Egyptians played it constantly. It showed up at parties, in homes, and in royal courts. But here's what most people don't know about Senet. It wasn't just a game. The Egyptians believed that successfully navigating the Senet board symbolized the soul's passage through the underworld, and Senet boards were placed in tombs to accompany the dead into the afterlife. Paintings in the tomb of Queen Nefertari show her playing Senet, and references appear in the Book of the Dead. Think about what that actually means. You're not just playing a board game. You're rehearsing your own death. Every move you make across that board is a symbolic step through the afterlife. Players believed that Senet revealed what obstacles lay ahead, warned dissolute souls of their fiery fates, and offered reassurance of the deceased's eventual escape from the underworld, as represented by successfully moving one's pieces off the board. So the Egyptians took their most popular casual pastime and turned it into literal spiritual insurance. The game went in the grave with you because you might need it on the other side. The game's rules evolved over nearly 2 millennia, shifting from a purely strategic contest to one increasingly governed by chance, perhaps reflecting changing theological ideas about fate and divine will. That's a remarkable thing. A board game that evolved alongside a religion, bending its mechanics to match whatever the culture believed about destiny at the time. That's not a toy. That's a philosophical document. And if Senet was the game of the afterlife, the royal game of yore was the game of everything else. The royal game of yore is the oldest playable board game in the world, originating around 4,600 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. It was found in the royal cemetery at Ur in Iraq, and what makes it extraordinary isn't just its age. The game's rules were written on a cuneiform tablet by a Babylonian astronomer in 177 BC, and from this, curator Irving Finkel was able to decipher the rules. 2 players compete to race their pieces from one end of the board to the other. We actually have the rulebook. Not a reconstruction, not an educated guess, an actual written explanation of how to play from the people who played it. That's almost unheard of for ancient games. Most of the time, archaeologists find a board and a pile of pieces and spend decades arguing about what was happening. With Ur, we know. The central squares were also used for fortune-telling. So even here, even in a game where we have the rules, the line between entertainment and spiritual practice is completely blurred. Be honest with yourself for a second. When you think about ancient people, do you imagine them as fundamentally different from you? More serious, more survival-focused, less interested in fun? The evidence keeps pushing back against that. Patolli, the great Aztec board game, was deeply embedded in Mesoamerican religious and social life. Players reportedly wagered everything from blankets and precious stones to their personal freedom, and the game was associated with Quetzalcoatl, the Aztec god of games. Playing without first making an offering to the deity was considered genuinely dangerous. So in Aztec society, you couldn't legally sit down for a board game without first making a religious offering. The stakes were that high. Among the Aztecs, Patolli held unusually high stakes, with participants wagering not just physical goods or currency, but their own lives. That's not boredom. That's a whole civilization organized partly around the outcome of a cross-shaped race game played with bean dice. And then there are the nomads. In a remote rock shelter in Azerbaijan, archaeologist Walter Christ identified a pattern of holes cut directly into the stone floor, a game board for a game known as 58 holes, or hounds and jackals, dating back roughly 4,000 years. Think about that for a moment. These were nomadic herders, constantly moving between migrations, and they stopped long enough to carve a game into solid rock. Not because they had to, because they wanted to play. In historical contexts, such activities not only provided diversion, but also fostered skills and social bonds, as seen in communal play and games among diverse classes. The game wasn't confined to cities or elites or people with leisure time built into their schedule. It was carved into the landscape by people who had almost nothing and still made time for it. Now here's the one I promised you at the start. The thing that I think is the most revealing entry in this whole story. The oldest joke ever recorded. The actual oldest joke we have written evidence of is a fart joke. A Sumerian tablet from around 1900 BC reads roughly, "Something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap." That's it. That's the joke. Some scholars think it's genuine humor. Others argue it was a moral proverb about discretion, which means we may have been misidentifying the world's oldest joke for over a century. We're not even sure it was meant to be funny. But here's what we do know. Someone in ancient Sumer thought this was worth writing down. They pressed it into clay and preserved it. Whether it was a joke or a proverb, the instinct to record something absurd, something that makes people groan or laugh or think, that instinct is 4,000 years old and completely unchanged. And then there's the oldest surviving bar joke, also from a Sumerian tablet, also about 4,000 years old. It reads, "A dog walks into a bar and says, 'I cannot see a thing.' I'll open this one. Nobody knows what that means." Scholars have proposed wordplay lost in translation, a warning about brothels disguised as bars, a reference to a drinking custom that no longer exists. The joke has outlived its own punchline. It's a 4,000-year-old setup with no explanation. And somehow, that might be the most human thing in this entire video. A joke so old we've forgotten why it was funny, written down by someone who thought it was worth saving. Here's what all of this actually adds up to. Early humans likely didn't draw a hard line between work and play. The dice weren't separate from survival. They were part of how strangers formed alliances. The board games weren't separate from religion. They were how people processed death and fate. The jokes weren't separate from culture. They were how people stayed human under pressure. Every single thing we've looked at today, from the Ice Age bone dice to the Sumerian punchline nobody can crack, points to the same conclusion. The urge to play, to laugh, to roll the dice and see what happens. That's not something humans developed after they got civilized. It's part of what made them civilized in the first place. You started this video thinking ancient humans killed time. What they were actually doing was building the architecture of human connection, one game at a time. The boredom was the point. The play was the work.